Hello, this is Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech number 185, doing the top 10 most skill-intensive cards in Magic. Yes, I know I just did a Hearthstone video today. Don't worry, guys, I'm not leaving you for Hearthstone. I am still here to play Magic. Magic is by far the best game out there, although Hearthstone's got a really nice online presence. Let's jump right in here. I am limiting this a little bit. Tutors are tough to play, but Tutors is not the particular skill that I'm talking about here. I am going to do another list at some point on the best tutors out there. Tutors are amazing, but they're not falling into the category here. Cards that just look at the top 3 cards of your library or the top card of your library, like Scry, I'm also not putting in this list. I'm looking for something much more in-depth, maybe even has some player interaction going on with it. So, although Ponder is a very high-skilled card, Sensei's Divining Top is a very high-skilled card that drives me nuts when people can't play it quickly, and Sylvan Library is a high-skilled card, they haven't made this list. Now, Brainstorm is the highest-skilled card out there. I'm not putting it on the list, though, because it falls into that look at top cards on your library list exception. It is an amazing card. Once you play it with fetch lands, it turns into a lot more than Sylvan Library or Ponder. It's nuts. But I've talked about it in lots and lots of videos, and I want to cover some new content here. I may do a Brainstorm-specific video at some point that just talks about all the intricacies of Brainstorm, and this is really a super high difficulty, high skill card. Some people think, oh no, you're just looking at the top few cards. But deciding when to play it, how to play it, when to play it in response to hand destruction. And the more you play it in Legacy, the more you play it in Vintage, the more you understand how amazing this card actually is. I definitely recommend playing this in any format you can. Number 10 here, I do have a tutor, but it has a restriction on it, in that you're only able to get things that are 1 higher. So you're interacting with this chain. Birthing Pod was recently banned in Modern because it's incredibly powerful. And where I see the most skill for it currently is in EDH. In EDH, it gives you a lot of different options. You really have to plan out your turns a little bit in advance. You can play it in decks that allow you to chain up by untapping it several times. I have done more math with this card than almost any other card on the list when I'm looking for a win and I'm trying to come up with creative ways to get around my opponent's creatures or what their particular outs are. Birthing Pod is a wonderful card in EDH, and I think it's even playable in something like Nick Fit in Legacy. Yes, it's a little bit high casting cost, but when you get to the higher things on that pod chain, Legacy just doesn't know how to deal with 5/5s and 6/6s that have enter the battlefield effects. Definitely check out Birthing Pod for a very high skilled card. So there's 3 wonderful cards on here, and I'm cheating as I do on all my top 10 lists, and I'm really going to give you like 20 plus cards. Factor Fiction is great because it makes your opponent make a choice with limited information, and how you respond psychologically while they're dividing those piles can be very interesting. It is the type of choice that I really like to see in Magic. It puts this psychological battle between you and your opponent. Gifts Ungiven has a lot more going on with it, and Intuition, particularly in EDH, you are grabbing singletons, and your opponent is trying to decide which one you really want. Now, there is a way to kind of cheat with gifts. It's just grabbing 2 cards, one of them being Unburial Rites, and the other one being a creature that you want back from the graveyard. That's not the situation in which I am talking about gifts. Gifts where you actually go get 4 cards, and 3 of them may help you, or 2 of them help you and 2 of them don't, and there's this psychological battle back and forth. That's where I'm talking about gifts being really interesting. Same thing, Intuition. If you're going and getting 3 accumulated knowledges, not that high skill. But in EDH, when you're going and getting 3 cards and they have to try to figure out what's going on, where the game state is, that's where it's really interesting. In the number 8 spot here, I've got Doomsday. And I've had a lot of people really disagree with me on this. They're like, oh, you just memorize an algorithm and you play the Doomsday stack that wins. And in Legacy, that's kind of what's going on. But in Vintage, Doomsday has multiple win conditions and a lot more singletons to deal with. This card and how you construct that stack, especially after sideboard, can be very difficult, very taxing to play. I definitely recommend giving this card a try, both in Legacy and in Vintage, because there's so much going on. You could also play it in EDH, although I think you're kind of comboing out at that point. You're missing the social aspect of the game. But overall, Doomsday is a very, very powerful card that with a lot of singletons in a deck can be really interesting to play. I've got Thoughtseize here next, and Thoughtseize is one of those cards where you have to know your opponent's deck to play it really efficiently. One of the things that people often do is just think about their plan. They're like, what disrupts me? And I'm going to pull that out and then continue on with my plan of playing Lily or playing Dark Confidant. But if you know your opponent's deck really well and you see crucial pieces to their plan, then you've got this choice between what's getting in the way of what I'm doing. Is that more important than disrupting them? Very, very good card. It has a nice drawback to it. This is one of the most balanced hand destruction cards out there. Definitely appreciate this card. The number 6 spot here, I've got Arcbound Ravager. And Arcbound Ravager seems like the type of card that just lets you win. Somebody tries to use removal, you sack it along with a few other artifacts, and pump up some other creature. But knowing your opponent's deck, knowing whether or not they're going to be able to remove that artifact, realizing that cards like Blinkmock Nexus are not an artifact now, but could be an artifact in response, and then sacrificed. I mean, I came into a recent GP trial game where my opponent missed the fact that they could sacrifice a Blinkmock Nexus to an Arcbound Ravager to get an extra point of damage and potentially win a game. This card is much more skill intensive than people realize. It is probably the toughest card to play in Affinity. There's this psychological reading what your opponent might have. There's making the best choice based on the information that you have. And it's a very interactive card. And when you screw it up, you can lose a game horribly. The number 5 spot here, I've got Deathrite Shaman, or the 1 casting cost Planeswalker of Doom. I've had several games playing Bug in both Vintage and in Legacy where what cards I exile mean that I win or lose the game. Being careful in looking at what's in each person's graveyard for the possible gush to be used later with a Yawgmoth's Will, or to keep a Tarmogoyf at bay for less damage is really important. Also, dueling Deathrites has a lot of timing issues involved. It can be very difficult for people to figure out what's going on. And when you learn about how mana sources work, the fact that they can't be countered, but that Deathrite's ability is not that mana ability because it has a target in it, it interacts with so many other things that it can be countered, it can be stopped. This is a wonderful card. Yeah, it's probably overpowered. So much is going on with it, people can definitely make mistakes with it. The number 4 spot here, I've got the Fetch Lands, and I'm going to have some tips here for playing Fetch Lands. Number 1, count your lands. I've had many competitive REL games and games with hundreds of dollars on the line in credit where people end up fetching and don't realize that the right combination of duel is still available or that they don't have any basics left. Know your lands. Number 2, know the distribution. Make sure that you've really set up the right distribution in your deck so that your fetches are matching up with your spells. Number 3, hold off on fetching. There's often times when you can get around Stifle, when you can get around Daze, if you fetch at the right time. So be aware of what your opponent's ways to interact with your fetches are and when the best time to fetch is. Take advantage of end of turn often. If someone has a way to interact, doing it at the end of their turn so that you then at least get to untap and give it another try, giving them less information after a draw is often the right choice, but not always. Also, be cognizant of your life. So think about the idea of thinning your deck, getting more good cards, and what your life total is and what type of a deck you're playing against. Deck thinning can be great against certain decks, and taking extra damage causes you huge problems against other decks. I'm going to talk about a few specific cards here. With regard to Pox, Pox makes you sacrifice land. And if you need more land to come up in future draws, it's often useful just to sacrifice one of your fetches that hasn't fetched yet, so that you've got a higher percentage chance to get to that real land later. Stifle is one of the most difficult cards to play around. Waiting for your opponent to fetch with their fetch and then fetching in response may give them less opportunity to stifle you. It's kind of a game of chicken often with fetches when there's stifle on the board. One of my favorite tricks is just when someone starts to fate seal you, leave a fetch on the board and then fetch after they've fate sealed you to frustrate their fate sealing. Really strong players will notice and they'll start brainstorming instead, but you can definitely catch people off guard. Fetches are what make Brainstorm amazing, so yes, Brainstorm is still on this list. It turns into Ancestral Recall when you take the dead cards in your hand, grab new cards, and shuffle them away. Tomb of Yawgmoth is another one to really be aware of. If you can turn these into swamps, you have a lot more flexibility, and then you need to decide where are you on your curve, do I need more land, or should I be deck thinning? And then Courser or Sensei's Divining Top is another way to get that card selection up significantly and use fetches to get rid of the cards that you don't need. Force of Will is number 3 on this list. It looks like a powerful card that you just throw off on the first turn to stop your opponent's plan. But each deck has key cards and then enablers. And it is often more important to wait for that key card, especially if you're playing against a deck that's light on counter spells. Waiting for them to set things up can be useful. Now, if you are able to glean that they're short on mana, and they're playing a card like Ponder or Brainstorm that is going to get them into that crucial element, then it may be useful to actually counter those cantrips. Knowing when and how to play Force of Will is a very, very good skill to have overall. In the number 2 spot here, I've got Hand Destruction, and I almost put Thoughtseize on here as an honorable mention, but it's powerful enough that it had its own spot. Cobble Therapy is very, very difficult Hand Destruction to play. Number 1, you've got to have a lot of knowledge. Knowledge is different than skill, but knowledge informs your choices so that you're making the best choices possible. My tips for playing this card is go out, look at the last Pro Tour, look at the last SCG and the top deck list, and look at what cards you can possibly remove out of somebody's hand given the deck that you're predicting they're on. Think about the outs that your opponent has to your particular strategy and call one of those outs. Cobble Therapy also gives you knowledge over whether it's safe to go off in a combo or to play a threat. So even if you know that you've got no chance of getting their card, think about the one card that could be an out. If it's not there, you at least have the knowledge in how to plan out your turns. And people miss that knowledge aspect. I've seen people hold this card waiting for a Gataxian Probe or a creature that they could sacrifice so that they can get the double action out of it. I also see people play it too early, but if you're going to play it really early, look at the top decks in the environment based on the land that is being played and think about what card you really want to pull out of that deck. Now, I've got some on here, and some of them are controversial here. With Bayous, if your opponent played Bayous on turn 1 and dropped a Deathrite, maybe Thoughtseize is a very good one to call. Tropical Island is one of the easier ones to play against because that's often in a deck for Tarmogoyfs. Tundra is often there related to counterbalance, although it could also be Geist, or it could be some other clock if they're playing red, white, blue, like Young Pyromancer. Plains? If my opponent has Plains in their deck, Aether Vial is the one I want to call, but that's likely what they're also going to drop on turn 1. If they drop a turn 1 Mother of Runes, though, I would still consider going after Aether Vial. Mountain, I would go after Lightning Bolt. It is the most flexible card out there, and it's often the second or third bolt that somebody plays. They're going to play the less flexible ones first and leave those as removal. Against Savannahs, Stoneforge Mystic is my personal choice currently, although Tarmogoyf is a close runner-up. Against Underground Seas, I'm worried about the combo decks, especially Storm, so I usually say LED, Lion's Eye Diamond, unless I know that they're really a bug player. And then I want to stop their Cascaders, so Shardless Agent's another option. And if your opponent has islands, Force of Will and Brainstorm are the two that I go after, depending on the type of deck that I'm playing. If it's a combo deck, Force of Will is what I want to pull out. If they're more of a control deck, Brainstorm is what I'm usually going after. The number one spot here, I've got Stifle. Stifle is a beautiful card. 1 blue crushes decks. It stops fetch lands, but where the skill comes in is realizing everything that is an activated or triggered ability, and then weighing which of those are really worth countering and which of them are not. Often, a fetch land is not the right choice. If the deck only has 2 or 3 mana as the top of its curve, and they're playing Brainstorms and they're smoothing their deck out, they may not need that extra land. Paying attention to things like Batterskull and when to counter the triggers. If they're using Stoneforge Mystic to go get it, you've got the option to counter right when the Stoneforge comes in. If I'm an aggro deck, that's not when I counter it. I let the Stoneforge go fetch something up. If I've got Thoughtseizes, I then try to remove it. In a tempo deck, I then wait until the Batterskull comes into play, and I counter the trigger that puts the germ into play. If I've got pressure on them, that takes them the most time, because they put the Stoneforge in, they've activated the Stoneforge to bring the Batterskull in, then they're going to have to spend 3 to return the Batterskull, and they're going to have to try it again. And hopefully I can kill them in that intervening time. Rest in Peace is also another really interesting one. Great graveyard hate, but it's got a triggered ability. When Rest in Peace enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all graveyards. If I've got a Tarmogoyf and a Nimble Mongoose on the board, or just one of those two, hitting that trigger on Rest in Peace means that my clocks stay huge damage, and Rest in Peace has little to no effect on my aggro plan. I would make a list of each of the top decks that have been winning in SCG for the last 6 months, and what the different activated and triggered abilities are in each of those decks. If I was going to be playing a deck with Stifle again, I played a lot of Rug Delver. It is one of the best decks for playing Stifle. Bug Delver is also really, really good in that regards. Stifle, amazing card, very high skill. Definitely see it misplayed a lot. This is the type of card that I like to see in Magic design because it interacts with so many things and can be misplayed so often. So you're probably asking at this point, where's the red? Why is there no red on this list? So no red skill, and I've really got 2 things to say. Number 1, there are some cards that have red skill. They just didn't make the list. I actually had a whole conversation on Magic the Seattling about this, and these were the 2 that almost made the list. Goblin Welder really has an exchange ability that's high skill on it. Sometimes you just crush, but when you're in Game 2 and Game 3, figuring out what exchanges to make is very interesting. And Punishing Fire has a lot of calculation going into it when playing Game 2 or Game 3 against surgical extractions. There's some timing elements. Wonderful card. Red also has a lot of skill in playing a red deck wins deck, but it's not the individual cards. It's putting the cards together in the way that the cards really interact and responding to your opponent's game state. So by no means am I saying that red is a low skill color. It's just the type of skill that's in it is around the entire deck usually, and not embedded in a single overpowered card. Thank you. This has been Brian Rowe with Mythic MTG Tech. If you've got a really high skilled card that you think should have made the list, please leave it in the comments. We've got a lot of great videos coming out this week, including an EDH deck tech in the next 10 days, a big announcement on the channel, and a legacy deck tech that I'm working on editing right now. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. You make Mythic MTG Tech possible. Until next time, this is Brian Rowe playing Magic the Gathering.